Now that you have your initial feature opportunity hypotheses, you need to refine them. In this section, we'll walk through how to refine your hypotheses about user value. Refining user value hypotheses requires you to engage directly with users. There are several quantitative and qualitative methods PMs can use to engage with users, but the one we'll focus on in this program is user interviews. You can find information on other research methods in the User Insights for Product Decisions program. Interviews are a foundational tool for product managers. They enable us to dive deep into the problems users are facing and build empathy for them. Understanding problems from a user's perspective ensures we're not just operating on assumptions, but grounding our actions in the actual user experience. There are 4 steps to productive user interviews. Together, these 4 steps ensure that you're gathering the right insights about the right users. The first step is to determine your interview audience to ensure that you're talking to the right users for this specific opportunity, and the second step is to recruit users from that target audience to speak with you. Third, structure the interview to ensure that you ask the right questions for the opportunity. The right questions will get you the right data. And finally, debrief and synthesize insights. This step bridges the gap between what users said in the interview and what you need to learn. At the end of the user interview process, you'll be able to build a user value map. The map includes 3 key components: user profile, which includes descriptions of the demographics, firmographics, and product behaviors for your target audience; user problem, which includes the severity of that problem and key alternatives to address the problem today; and user goals, which includes qualitative and quantitative metrics, as well as any non-goals for this opportunity. By conducting user interviews, we'll be able to pressure test and refine our understanding of the user profile and user problem for our feature. We can then add these refined hypotheses to our user value map and use them to make any necessary updates to the user goals we set out to achieve during the manager briefing. In this section, we'll walk through how to complete the 4 steps necessary to conduct effective user interviews and build out your user value map. You can use the Refine User Value template to complete the steps for your feature. Along the way, we'll practice applying these concepts using a real feature opportunity from Gusto, a platform that provides payroll, hiring, and benefit solutions for small to medium-sized businesses. Before we jump into the 4-step process, we'll start with some context about this example. The feature opportunity being explored at Gusto was an improvement to the new employee onboarding experience. Let's take a look at a condensed version of the user value hypotheses that the Gusto PM documented during their manager briefing. This opportunity addresses a problem for fast-growing businesses on Gusto. The team believes that the primary user problem here is that a ton of setup work is needed to onboard a new employee, so much so that it's easy to make mistakes that ultimately hurt both the new employee and the employer. To address this problem, the team wants to build an onboarding solution that makes it easier for employers to track all the tasks and deadlines necessary to give a new employee a smooth onboarding experience. We'll illustrate how the Gusto team validated these hypotheses throughout this lesson. The first step to running effective interviews is to determine the right audience for the interview. When determining their audience, PMs often make the mistake of reaching for the low-hanging fruit. They speak with the most convenient audience instead of taking the time to determine the right people to speak to. This means they end up talking to users from previous user panels assembled for other projects, or they interview the most active and enthusiastic users, or they collect anecdotal evidence from people who have left reviews or contacted customer support and assume that represents the general population. But all of these users aren't necessarily the ones experiencing the problem the PM is trying to solve. It's not enough to choose just any active user and hope that they will help you learn what you need to know. Determining the correct interview audience will help you get the most helpful insights the quickest. For example, a very common mistake PMs make is to interview existing users about the features they would ideally want and try to use that information to figure out why prospects aren't buying. But these are completely different audiences. It's impossible to apply insights from someone who decided to buy to someone who decided not to buy. Instead, they should talk to people who ultimately did not choose to buy the product and see what can be learned from them. Here's another example. Uber started in the US and did plenty of user research to gather insights on how to recruit drivers locally. But when they wanted to expand to other countries, these insights didn't necessarily translate. Interviewing people in the US did not provide them with the insights that they needed to recruit drivers in India, for example. To learn what it would take to recruit drivers in India, Uber needed to interview potential drivers there to find out what motivated them. To determine the right interview audience for your project, you need to do 3 things. Start with a target user profile for your company or product as a whole. Let's call this the company user profile. Then identify how the target audience for your project differs from the company user profile. Finally, identify secondary attributes that add diversity to your project's target audience. Let's start with the first part, your company's user profile. It's important to determine the user profile for the company first because you need to understand how your new target audience fits into or stands out from the company's audience. In other words, you need to establish a baseline from which to expand or find a subset. To establish this baseline, we'll define 2 types of attributes for the user profile. We'll define demographics, such as age, gender, or geography, for B2C companies, and firmographics, such as company size, role, or industry, for B2B companies. We'll also define product behaviors, such as user status, frequency of engagement with the product or feature, device or platform type, or paid versus free users. The next step is to identify how the target audience for your project differs from the company user profile. There are 2 common scenarios in which your audience will deviate from the company's existing user profile. One is when you're trying to expand the existing profile to include a new segment. The attributes of that new segment would then determine your project's target audience. Take Hims, for example, a U.S. startup that provides medical services and products for men. When the company launched Hers, it expanded its company user profile to include women of all ages who had not been a part of Hims' initial customer base. The Hers product team would need to conduct user research with women, whose telemedicine behavior and needs might look very different from the original male user base. The second common deviation is when you're trying to solve a problem for a subset of the existing profile. In this case, the attributes of that subset determine your project's target audience. Let's imagine you're a PM at Bumble, and you're working on a feature to increase the number of user profiles specifically for 25 to 35-year-olds living in suburban areas. Your interviews should specifically focus on this subset. Speaking with folks in the broader Bumble user population won't bring you closer to refining user value for this particular opportunity. For each key attribute of your existing audience, you can determine how your project's target audience is similar or different. Finally, layer on secondary attributes that add diversity to your project's target audience. At this stage, you want to identify 1 or 2 attributes that vary within the target audience you've defined and may have an impact on the user's behavior and problems. It's important to have diversity like this within your target audience because you want to get as many relevant perspectives as possible. Otherwise, you'll end up with a biased view, which could result in a solution that doesn't fully address the problem. Jay-Z remembers her team benefiting from a diverse user research audience when they were trying to improve the host experience at Airbnb. The team included international users in their research and discovered that some geographies use mobile phones more often for transactions and interactions. Effectively delivering value to these users would require an optimized mobile experience in addition to an optimized desktop experience. Jay-Z shares, "If we had only talked to hosts in the US, we would have gotten a biased view of the problem and might have come up with a solution that wasn't relevant to all of our target audience." Let's define the research audience for Gusto's onboarding feature. Gusto's company user profile is small to medium-sized businesses, or SMBs, that are looking for people management solutions. This feature's audience differs from the overall company user profile because it targets a specific subset, SMBs that are growing headcount rapidly. As such, the team defines the research audience as SMBs that are doubling their headcount over the next year. An onboarding solution will likely be of high value to these businesses since they'll need to onboard more new employees than a slower-growing business. The team then identifies some key attributes to build diversity into the target audience. First, they plan to talk to different types of decision-makers within companies. For example, they can interview people leads and chief people officers who own the functions that will primarily use the tool. In addition, they can speak to CFOs and CEOs who might own the final purchase decision, depending on the company size. Beyond different decision makers, the team also plans to ensure diversity in company size and stage. They want to speak to earlier stage startups as well as more mature SMBs to understand whether their needs are different. After defining your target interview audience, you can move to the second step, recruiting interviewees. You can follow the 3 S's when recruiting your interview audience. The first is to source or find possible participants that match your target user profile, then screen. Reach out to possible participants and screen them for their fit with the target user profile. Finally, schedule. Create an interview schedule that maximizes your ability to gather insights. Let's start with sourcing users to interview. In sourcing, we start by answering this question: how do we find the people we want to interview? To find potential interview participants, you can use either internal data or third-party data. The internal information approach tends to work best when your audience is past or present users. Your access to internal data may differ depending on your company. As a new PM, you'll need to determine whether you can gather this data yourself or whether you'll need help from an internal partner. Then you can narrow down possible participants based on the attributes you outlined in the last step, as long as you can tie the information to their contact information, like an email address. For example, Dropbox has a beta program where existing users can sign up to test upcoming features. Dropbox PMs can then easily source users from the beta program who match their target audience. But internal data may not work so well in instances where you want to target a new audience or where you don't have a linkage between users and their email addresses. Third-party data comes in handy when you want to speak with people who have not used the product or when you can't identify users in your data. For example, say Instacart wants to talk to users that didn't sign up for their service. Since they have no contact information for the people who arrived at their page but didn't sign up, they'll need to go to an external source. Instacart could use research firms and their demographic data to track down users who aren't signing up for their service. The ideal outcome of the sourcing process is that you end up with a list of names, a way to contact them, and which pieces of the target audience profile they match. After determining how to find this audience, the next question to answer is, how many people do we need to contact? On average, you only really need to talk to about 6 people to get a sense of what your users are thinking. While individual results may vary, once you're over 6 people, you're more likely to start hearing the same thing over and over again, which means you're getting less value out of each conversation. Let's do some quick back-of-the-envelope math, working backward through the recruitment process to figure out how many people you need to source. For simplicity, let's say you want to be able to talk to 6 people per audience, and you have 2 distinct audiences. This means you want to talk to 12 people in total. While rates differ dramatically, here are some pretty typical numbers for illustration. Let's say that about 1/3 of people who respond to your initial contact and screener are a bad fit, so you decide not to speak with them right away. 2/3 are a good fit. So if you want to speak to 6 people per condition, you'll need to hear back from 9 people per condition. But an average response rate to a cold initial contact and screener email is about 5 to 10%. We'll assume 10% here. With that math, if we want to hear back from 9 people per condition, we'll need to reach out to 90 people per condition. That's the bad news. It takes a lot of upfront work to identify possible participants and recruit them. While the numbers may be slightly different for you and your organization, this is a helpful starting point for planning out your recruiting efforts. What do you do when you simply can't find this many people? That's when you shift focus to increasing the response rate. You have several levers at your disposal to help get people's attention and to get them to respond. You might increase the compensation you're offering or add more context and a personal touch to your email, such as why you think their input specifically would be helpful. Or you might look for warm introductions so people are more inclined to respond to you. If you're talking to an existing user, an introduction from someone they already have a relationship with, like their account manager, could go a long way to helping you get a response from them. The next step is to reach out to a random subset of the possible participants you just sourced and screen them effectively. Contacting usually ends up being a bit of an iterative process. A good rule of thumb is to email half of your audience in the first send and then follow up with more as needed. You don't want to send all the emails at once in case you have a higher response rate than you'd expected. Effective contact emails have two parts: a short description of why you want to talk to them specifically, and a screener questionnaire. The screener doesn't need to be exhaustive, but should be just enough to confirm that they're both interested and a good fit for the conversation. Not only do you want to make sure you're not wasting your own time, but you also want to make sure you're not wasting users' time. Someone who is a good fit for your interviews needs to match your audience and also encompass some degree of diversity within the profile if applicable. So the questions in the screener should ask about any attributes of the target audience that you need participants to self-report on, things you aren't able to confirm through other data sources. For example, it's common to ask whether or not someone is the final decision maker in small business surveys. You can look up their title, company size, and industry, but you have to ask them if they have the authority to make purchasing decisions. You can't get that information any other way. As responses come in, you can start following up with people who are a good fit for your interviews. Primarily, you're looking for confirmation that people are interested and match your target audience. Then you want to ensure that you're getting a suitable level of diversity within the target audience. The final stage is scheduling. Here you want to be intentional about how you stagger your interviews. We'll give you a few good rules of thumb for scheduling. First, schedule time internally for debriefing after each interview. Practically, this means spacing out your interviews so they're not all back to back to back. Context switching takes energy, so minimize that as much as possible. It's helpful to talk to similar profiles on the same day, since that makes it easier to compare and contrast their perspectives. Being thoughtful about the gaps between interviews and the ordering of interviews will help you get as much out of them as possible. We've now covered the first two steps of the user interview process: determining the interview audience and recruiting them. In the next lesson, we'll walk through how to structure and conduct effective interviews.